it's Lee from Colouring Queen, and I hope you're all doing well today. Today I'm colouring from Rising colouring book by Karolina Kubikowska. Now this is actually the clickbound edition of the book that has coil binding which actually snaps open and closed. Now this book sold out super fast, but you can still get the hardback edition, and I'll put a link below where you can see a flip through of that and the extended review. Now before I forget, I have a giveaway for the hardback edition that you can check out the community tab for that or at the link below this video. Now before I go on with today's colour and story, I have to tell you I did something stupid. I fell in love with this picture of the little girl witch as soon as I seen it, and I actually copied the page so I could work out a colour palette for it. And that's the great thing about the click binding on it. It was super easy to take out and copy. So I decided on a purple dress with lots of green and a pastel type coloured area. And she looks like a little white witch to me. So the area where her little wand is, I'm going to colour in a range of pastels and use my Prismacolors for this picture. So the stupid thing, well, usually when I do colouring videos, I record them a bit at a time. I colour one thing to basically show you what I'm doing, like a flower. Then I colour the rest of the things, like all the rest of the flowers, offline because it's easier and faster for me without having a light and camera in the way. Then I record a bit more and take all the recorded bits, stitch them together to make one whole video or maybe two videos if it's a big picture. So that's what I did with this picture. I actually had the books for weeks in advance before I uploaded my review of it, and I had hours of video recorded. Then of course my computer started to tell me that my memory was full, so I went crazy moving stuff around to the external drive. I deleted stuff, and I think you can see where this is going. All my hours of recording I must have accidentally deleted, and I've spent hours combing my hard drives, my iCloud backup, but it's all gone because I'd had it for so long. You've only got 30 days to recover that, so you have to basically see the end of my picture rather than all the work that I did in the beginning. So I'm pretty upset about it, but at least I can colour more of Karolina's pictures, so there's always a bonus. So I think she's a little white witch, which according to the dictionary is someone who practices magic for altruistic purposes, basically through different ways like healing or blessing or charms, incantations, prayers, songs, and they're known for their empathy and intuition with a respect for traditions and folklore and a spiritual journey, using their knowledge just for positive purposes. And you'll often see crystals and healing in amongst white witch stuff. And she looks too sweet to be anything other than a white witch to me. She's not a Halloween style witch. So a quick Google search actually tells me that white witches are actually on the rise. There are heaps of books on Amazon, there are podcasts, YouTube channels, you name it. And one reason that people feel that this is happening is it's a reflection of the current instability in the world. No matter where we look in the world, there is some sort of turmoil with varying degrees. And during these times, it's only natural to expect that people want to heal their problems and will turn to whatever methods they believe can help. Now, this of course led me down a rabbit hole of looking at the laws of witchcraft in Australia, and surprisingly, some pretty horrible cases. What surprised me though were the many laws that were intertwined with the witchcraft laws, like the Tax Act or immigration laws. Now, I can't tell you about those cases on this channel because they are really, really dark. But because I have a gorgeous girl to colour, I wanted to tell you a story about something that relates to the picture. And then I remembered the Blitz Witch. So here goes. We're going back in time to Scotland. It was 1897 when Victoria Helen McFarlane was born. Now, not much was known about her early childhood, but she would later become infamous. Her parents were working class churchgoers who ensured their young daughter attended school, but her behaviour at school was deeply concerning, not only to her schoolmates, but also to her mother. You see, young Victoria Helen liked to tell her classmates about her predictions and prophecies, and this was all doom and gloom apparently. It was actually so intense that it caused a lot of distress to those around her. Now, eventually, Victoria, who was called Nellie, left school and started work at the Royal Infirmary in Dundee, and there she met and married Henry Duncan, who'd been injured in the war and was now working as a cabinet maker. The two would soon have children, 6 that lived, and sadly 6 that did not. But Nellie suffered poor health, not just because of the multiple children and pregnancies that she had been through, but also from struggles with her weight. She was over 300 pounds. Now, she still had predictions, and I think because of her weight struggles and ill health and the number of children that they were raising, that her and her husband decided that they would turn her work as a medium into a bit of a side hustle. Now, eventually, they decided to turn that into a business where I believe that Nellie also did tea leaf reading and clairvoyance, and this would help the family earn a little bit more money. Now, by 1926, she was offering seances in which she summoned up spirits, and the family moved to Edinburgh at that time, and spiritualism was incredibly popular, and she soon became really well known in the town for her clairvoyant work. Now, according to the National, there were rumours that even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was one of the spirits that she was able to produce at her sittings. Now, Nellie and Henry and her husband, they set up a seance room, and Nellie would contact spirits via her guide. It was either Peggy or Albert in their home. Now, Albert was apparently, he was a bit partial to singing south of the border, and Peggy, she liked to sing a little bit of Loch Lomond, which was a song about 2 Scottish soldiers. Now, as well as the spirit guides, there was also a cat and a rabbit, and of course, a parrot called Bronco. Both of these guys, they spoke through Nellie in young and childish voices that many claim were very credible. Now, in this dark room, visitors would notice ectoplasm that would manifest out of Nellie's mouth and nose. Now, a medium or a clairvoyant or a spiritualist, whatever label you would like to put on it, that has actual ectoplasm, like a manifestation, appearing, was pretty uncommon. The London Spiritualist Alliance group actually took an interest in Nellie, and for over 8 months between 1930 and 1931, they actually attended 50 sittings with her to determine whether she was really gifted or if it was all a sham. Her miracles were actually written up in the spiritual press, and the public was invited to pay for sittings with her. By April of 1931, Henry, her husband, invited Harry Price to come and observe. Now, Harry Price is a British psychic researcher and author. He gained public prominence for his investigation into physical phenomena and exposing fraudulent spiritualist mediums. There's actually a whole website dedicated to his research and the things he found, including this case here as well. So Harry Price accepted, and this was the first scientific test ever held with Nellie Duncan, and it took place just a month later on May the 4th. Now, as well as Harry Price, there was also a number of other distinguished people, including Professor William McDougall, who was an eminent psychologist. Now, Harry Price conducted a series of experiments with Nellie Duncan, and in these seances, she claimed that she could materialize spirits using ectoplasm. Now, this ectoplasm was actually examined by Price and other experts, and they found evidence suggesting that this was just a little bit more common than you might expect. It was actually paper or cheesecloth mixed with egg white or a resinous fluid, and sometimes even toilet paper. Now, despite these findings, which were pretty damning for Nellie Duncan, because they were basically saying the ectoplasm was fraud, Duncan continued to gain popularity among spiritualists. In one particular test, they even tried to use x-rays to examine her stomach, suspecting it as being the hiding place for the material used in the seances, because when they attended, she actually allowed them to inspect all her outerwear, including her underwear. And so the only thing that could make sense is that she must be hiding this ectoplasm inside her stomach. It was the only place that they were unable to look, and they suspected that she was a regurgitator, meaning that she swallows it and then is able to pull this vast wad of paper and material out of her either mouth and other orifices. At first, Nellie resisted the examination. There was a little bit of a scene, and eventually they managed to secure a piece of this material, and on analysis, it was actually found out to be a flattened paper tube. So even after this report, it didn't matter. She was so popular. She gained official recognition from spiritualist organisations, and she continued to perform seances across the country with a large range of supporters. So in 1933, just 2 years later, our friend Nellie, she found herself in a little bit of a pickle during a reading. You see, a lady named Miss Esson Moore attended a sitting, and she did something unexpected. She was a distinguished lady from Scotland, and she decided to have a seance with Nellie, and she even invited some other well-known folks to watch the seance and sit with her. And this seance took place in January. Now, as the seance went on, the usual spirits made their appearance, but here's where it gets interesting. Toward the end, Miss Moore couldn't help herself, and she decided to make a grab for one of the spirits, who was Peggy, and it turned into a little bit of a tug-of-war, if you can imagine, with Miss Moore absolutely determined to get a hold of Peggy, and she managed to tear Peggy, or the material, and she even got her arm through this manifestation, but in the end she had to let it go. Now, it turned out to be nothing more than some cleverly arranged cheesecloth. The police were called, and the whole thing caused quite a stir. Now, later on, in a sworn affidavit from several witnesses, they confirmed that Peggy was nothing more than a woman's undershirt made of like stocking fabric, and they even convinced Nellie to hand it over, and you could clearly see the tears where Miss Moore's arms had gone through it. But the legal authorities in Scotland were taking quite an interest in this affair, and Nellie was actually arrested and put on trial for fraudulent mediumship, and the whole thing unfolded in Edinburgh over 2 days. And finally, in May, Nellie was convicted and fined £10, or alternatively a month in prison. But that wasn't it for Nellie. So after all that legal drama with Mrs. Duncan, something else happened at the AGM of the Spiritualist National Association. You would think that after all of these incidences, which really point to a lot of props being used in these sittings, that the association which represented spiritualists in Great Britain wouldn't want a bar of it. But actually, at their AGM, they voted, 57 people voted to keep their trust in Mrs. Duncan, and only 2 people were like, not so sure about this. And they even went ahead and renewed their diploma or certificate they'd previously given to her. So it was like a vote of confidence from the whole group. And none of this was a career stopper. Nellie continued, it seems, without suffering any harm or damage to her business. Her reputation was that good. Now, we come to the war, World War II, and it's 1941, and it's the thick of it. People all over the UK were anxious to hear about their loved ones. And that year, Nellie and her family moved to Portsmouth, home of the Royal Navy. Now there, Nellie apparently summoned the spirit of a sailor who solemnly declared, "My ship is sunk." This sailor was said to be wearing a Royal Navy hat band with the name on it, HMS Barham. Now, this was absolutely shocking because at this point, the sinking of the Barham was not known to the public. It was November 25th in 1941, and you've got the Barham, a hefty Royal Navy battleship, and it was cruising along with a couple of its buddies off the coast of Egypt. They're there to keep an eye on some Italian convoys, and they're zigzagging like mad, guarded by 8 destroyers. But trouble is lurking beneath the calm sea. This crafty submarine commander, Colonel Hans Dietrich von Tiesenhausen, slips his U-331 past the British destroyers and lets loose 4 torpedoes aimed right at the looming battleship. The Barham, weighing in at a hefty 31,000 tonnes, didn't stand a chance. 3 torpedoes hit its port side and things went south fast. The ship lost all power. It started tilting like crazy, and within moments it met its end in a massive explosion. It was a spectacle caught on film by a cameraman on another nearby battleship, the HMS Valiant. Debris and men were catapulted into the air, leaving survivors surrounded by a thick layer of oil in the water. Unfortunately, over 800 soldiers and officers lost their lives, while 300 odd were thankfully rescued. Now here's the kicker. The sinking was supposed to be a big secret. Only the families of the casualties, a total of about 800, were in the know, and that wasn't until January of 1942, some months later. Then, in the chaos that had followed the torpedo of the battleship, von Tiesenhausen himself had no clue how his attack had played out. He heard the torpedoes go off, but he didn't know what happened next. He didn't know what he had hit. He radioed to say he'd hit a battleship, but he wasn't sure of the outcome or what battleship it was. Little did he know, the British codebreakers were actually listening in. Seeing an opportunity to throw their enemies off track and keep up morale back home, the Admiralty kept the Barham sinking under wraps. They figured they'd successfully contained the news of losing one of their last big battleships. But let me tell you, secrets have a way of getting out, don't they? And you won't believe how this one got out. Now fast forward to November 27th, just 2 days after the Barham's sinking, Winston Churchill himself sent a telegram to the Australian Prime Minister John Curtin explaining that they were keeping the Barham's loss under wraps because they didn't want to give Japan any encouragement. You see, during these intense wartime years, Britain's leaders were doing everything they could to keep an edge, and I apologise for Millie walking in the background. They went to great lengths to keep the truth from reaching the public and the Axis powers. They even went so far as to print and send Christmas and New Year's cards to the crew of the sunken battleship, even those who had tragically lost their lives. They realised that not sending these cards would raise suspicions about the Barham's status. And they used more traditional tricks too. On January the 8th of 1942, Admiral Cunningham put out an article in the Glasgow Herald titled "All's Well with the Navy in the Mediterranean." He did admit that they'd faced some tough odds, but his positive tone hardly matched the actual situation, with 3 battleships now in the Mediterranean either sunk or severely damaged in just 3 months. They even played with the numbers on their supply and production records. For November of 1941, the records conveniently left out any mention of the Barham's loss, but by December 41, they couldn't avoid including the sinking of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse in the South China Sea, but still not the Barham. And after a few weeks, the War Office decided it was finally time to inform the families of those lost on the Barham. But here's the twist. They added a special plea for secrecy. They told the families not to discuss the ship's loss with anyone but close relatives, emphasising that it was crucial to keep this info from the enemy until it was officially announced. The sinking of the Barham was actually filmed. A cameraman named John Turner actually filmed those final moments of the Barham, and the Navy held on to that footage until 1945. You can see it on YouTube now if you want to see that. It wasn't until late January of 1942 that the German High Command caught wind of the Barham's loss, and only then did the British government come clean. They informed the press on January the 27th, a few weeks after, and explained their reasoning for keeping it hush-hush. And by that time, with tough Allied losses mounting in the Pacific, not much was written about the torpedoed battleship or the government censorship that had taken place. When news of the Barham sinking actually reached Germany, von Tiesenhausen was actually awarded a Knight's Cross. But here's the kicker. The HMS Barham hadn't been reported in the press as having suffered any battle damage. In reality, it had been sunk and the government was keeping it all very quiet at the time that Nellie held that seance. So how on earth did she know? How did Nellie predict a thing when the families didn't even know at that stage? Now, word of Nellie's uncanny prediction reached the police and intelligence agencies. They were not only baffled, but they were deeply concerned. I mean, how could she have known something that hadn't been released to the public yet? Plus, there was a real concern that if she knew that, she might know other information that could seriously jeopardise the war effort, in particular the D-Day strategy. Now, this was not the last of the news from the HMS Barham. In January of 1944, Nellie returned to Portsmouth and she set up a business above a chemist shop, and the business was the Masters Temple Psychic Centre. The owners of the chemist shop, Ernest and Elizabeth Homer, they were a spiritualist couple, and as well as serving their spiritual needs, they were also able to register that business as a psychic centre. This gave them a break on paying rates, so it was quite advantageous for them. Now, Ernest helped in the business. He took the fees as people arrived for the seance, and Nellie did great business. It was estimated in just 1 week she conducted 13 seances there, bringing in a whopping total of £104. Now, in one seance, the mother of a missing Royal Air Force navigator, Frederick Nuttall, she was heartbroken to hear that her son had been a casualty of war. But in another seance later in the week, she was told he was alive and well and living in France and being cared for. Of course, this hope would soon be dashed when it was discovered that he had indeed been lost in a plane crash a year prior. So Nellie's predictions weren't really accurate, and they could change from day to day, it seems. But who knows? I mean, most things aren't 100% accurate, are they? So not everyone was a fan of Nellie's work, and soon there were some complaints. During that January, Nellie held one more seance, and she sat in the corner of a darkened room behind curtains, and there was just one red lamp glowing in the room. 30 people were at this seance. They were organised into 3 semicircular rows, and inside that audience were some very special unknown guests. Albert would then indicate that he had a message for someone sitting in a particular chair. Now, Albert was the spirit guide, and when they responded, this ectoplasm or form would manifest in the room. It was reported that sometimes the parrot Bronco would squawk, "Pretty Polly," at this stage. Sometimes Albert liked to entertain the crowd, and he encouraged them to sing his favourite song, South of the Border. This activity was meant to encourage the manifestation to appear. Now, sometimes it would be Peggy, and others it would be Albert. Who knew? While the audience members sat captivated, waiting in anticipation, a white figure appeared before them, ready to give messages from the spirit world. The constable pulled out his whistle and he blew it. A torch was put on, and according to the Telegraph, there was a bit of a scuffle before the police charged up the stairs, and a policeman dived on this formation. It turned out to be Mrs. Duncan with a shroud on, and when they torches lit up the area, Nellie could be seen standing behind the curtains clad in white. Others in the audience turned on the lights and ushered in more police. There were actually undercover naval and police officers all throughout this seance, ready to strike when they seen something that gave them the impetus to do so. Now, not long after this, Nellie was arrested again for suspicion, this time of defrauding the attendees. Now, as well as Nellie, the chemist shop owners and her booking manager were also arrested. The Portsmouth Chief Constable declared her to be an unmitigated humbug and pest. Now, she was charged initially under the Vagrancy Act, which had traditionally been used to prosecute fortune tellers, but 2 months later, when it went to trial at the Old Bailey, she faced charges under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. Now, this law was originally passed during the reign of King George II, but it had laid dormant for 100 years. It hadn't been used in other cases, but they dusted it off and they used it for the prosecution of Nellie Duncan, together with the 2 chemist shop owners and her booking agent. Now, the Witchcraft Act, unlike the Vagrancy Act, it actually had a heavier penalty and a prison sentence was attached to it. The act was aimed at people who charge fees for fraudulent divination, healing, or not the supposed practice of these magical acts. And it seems like this old piece of law was actually being used to send a very clear message, not only aimed at Nellie with the penalty provisions of the law, but also by association, labelling her as a witch rather than a psychic, a clairvoyant, or a medium. Now, this has been a source of contention for fans and family of Helen Duncan, as they claim that she was not a witch but a talented psychic, and it's wrong to label her as such, and it's actually caused them a lot of trauma and stigma. Her children recalled incidents of them being teased unmercifully when they were younger because of this witch label that had attached to their family. Now, the trial of Nellie Duncan and the cohorts began on the 23rd of March 1944, and it actually lasted a week. It was a trial by media, attracting widespread press coverage. The prosecution claimed that the whole seance was just an elaborate pretense, a fraudulent performance, a mere imposition on human credulity. The prosecutors introduced evidence that Duncan revealed the loss of Barham in 1941 while it remained an Admiralty secret, and the undercover agents who broke up the Portsmouth seance testified against Duncan. Now, the defence had 19 to 24 witnesses, depending on which source you believe, who testified that Duncan had summoned the spirits of their dead relatives and friends, and they believed her manifestations were genuine. The defence team also suggested that Duncan hold a seance in the courtroom, but the prosecution put the kibosh on that and refused the offer. Mrs. Duncan herself was asked to give evidence so that the prosecution could cross-examine her. However, her defence lawyers pointed out that as she was in a trance during the seances, she wouldn't be able to answer questions about what had transpired because she wouldn't be able to remember. Now, according to the national news, the witnesses were very credible, and the prosecution was able to produce evidence that the materialisations and the ectoplasm that was produced was by a fraudulent device and apparatus, so cheesecloth and egg whites. The prosecution also told many attendees had been left confused and distressed by the messages from the spirit guides, just like that mother that had been told that her son was alive and then dead again. And it seems that sometimes messages went to the wrong person. They swapped seats unbeknown to the guide, or sometimes there were messages from relatives that were still very much alive. It took 7 days for the 6 men and 1 woman in the jury, but they eventually found all 4 guilty of a breach of the Witchcraft Act, specifically a conspiracy to violate the Witchcraft Act. And Millie was sentenced to 9 months in London's Holloway Women's Prison. but she would only serve 6 before being released. During this time, she was known as the Blitz Witch, in reference to the war, or Hellish Nell, according to some sources. She's also credited as being the last person convicted under the Act, but according to the national news, there were 3 other people alongside her on trial: the owners of the chemist shop and Francis Brown, who was Nellie's booking agent. And there was also one sent to prison as well months later. And in September of the same year, Jane York from East London was charged under the same act for pretending to conjure up the spirits of the dead, but she was simply fined £5 and put on a good behaviour bond for 3 years. So even though it doesn't appear to be true that she was the last witch of the UK, the name seems to have stuck, maybe because she was the last witch that was imprisoned under that act. Funnily enough, or not funny for Nellie, she was denied the right of appeal to the House of Lords, which is pretty unusual. And many always have believed that Nellie had special powers. They were absolutely horrified at her conviction. And not everyone in the government was on board with the whole effort to convict her either. Believe it or not, even Winston Churchill himself weighed in on it, and he shot off a letter to his Home Secretary expressing his discontent, calling the whole thing absolute tomfoolery to the detriment of the necessary work of the court. And, frivolous cases do take up the court's time, and this took a week. That's a long time to hold a court up. Many years ago, the cost of opening one court in the Supreme Court in New South Wales was over $70,000. So, back then, just having one court for 7 days, it's a lot of money, especially when there is a war going on and there's other more pressing cases. So I can understand Churchill's point of view on that one, but the prosecutors decide what they're going to prosecute. Now, there are people today that still stand up for Helen Duncan, and they suggest that Churchill had a bit of a soft spot too for spiritualist ideas. In fact, it was during his second stint in government that they eventually scrapped the Ancient Witchcraft Act in 1951, and they swapped it out for the Fraudulent Mediums Act. But here's the thing. Churchill probably just seen this as a big distraction from the more pressing matters of war, and maybe even a bit of an embarrassment for his government. It was getting such widespread coverage, and there was, a war in process and getting to the wrap-up stage. So who knows what the motivation for that was. But the Homers, the people that owned the chemist, they actually returned to the chemist after the trial, and they stayed there until the early 1950s, and after that the building was left vacant for many, many years. There's a suggestion floating around that the whole trial was a consequence of the fear that her seances in Portsmouth were accurate and that she actually might know something that would spill the beans on the timing of the upcoming D-Day invasion. Now, if she had that knowledge that wasn't released to the general public, that could be a terrible threat to the war effort. And the government seemed to view her uncanny knowledge of the Barham sinking as a real red flag for potential wartime security breaches. But if you step back and take a look at it, the whole idea of sending an uneducated and frail woman with a knack for the supernatural off to the jail might seem like a peculiar focus for a country currently at war. So when Nellie left prison, it's claimed that she continued to work as a medium until her death at the age of 59. And there's always been this mystery with the Barham and Nellie. The two things seem to be very close in the UK. A year after Nellie's death in 1957, a group of Barham veterans actually got together to form the Barham Survivors Association, where every May relatives and survivors get together for a dinner at Portsmouth. And there was actually one attendee that was a bit of a surprise, and that was Commander Hans Dietrich von Tiesenhausen, the one that torpedoed the Barham and ended up being awarded for it. He was actually a prisoner of war in England, and after that in Canada, where he eventually moved and worked as an interior decorator and photographer. And then he eventually, he became a part of this Barham survivors group as well. And he was interviewed before his death in 1998. He was interviewed and he couldn't believe the story of Nellie Duncan and its relationship to the Barham. He said no government should be allowed to treat a poor woman so terribly. If some of the Barham's surviving sailors can accept the U-boat captain who sank the battleship, perhaps the British government will pardon a witch who guessed at too many wartime secrets. So these legacies continue, and if you're in the UK, you can see that the Barham's crew are commemorated by a memorial bench at North Gardens in Weymouth, and they've also had memorial services for them at Westminster Abbey. And of course, Nellie Duncan has also been commemorated as well. There is a bust of her with some controversy attached after local members didn't want it in the visitors centre. There is a bust of her at the Stirling Smith Art Gallery and Museum in Callander, Scotland, where she was born. Now, Nellie's grandchildren have petitioned the government over the years to grant her a posthumous pardon, but this has been rejected. Mrs. Martin, Nellie's granddaughter, insists that her mother was a genuine spiritualist, an ordinary woman with a gift, and she wants her name cleared for this terrible injustice. She asked rhetorically, why did they spend 10 days trying an old lady for witchcraft? She said the whole arrest was silly, really. If they'd spoken to her, she would have stopped giving seances until the war was over. Let's be honest, she'd 2 sons in the Navy and 1 in the RAF, and my father's in the Army, so why would she turn around and put the country at risk? The Home Office have said that a petition for a free pardon is extremely rare for the Home Secretary to use his power to do that, and the last one that they did was for Alan Turing. But the question remains at the end of the day, although Duncan was convicted of witchcraft, how did she know that the ship had been sunk? Now, some theories are that the sinking wasn't as secret as the Admiralty hoped, and that there were some loose lips or rumours that Nellie got hold of and she had a lucky guess. Others believe that she had genuine powers. Medium Jerry March believed that Nellie did have special powers, but when her powers were no longer reliable, she resorted to a little bit of theatre and tricks to ensure her audience got a good show. There have been books, radio plays about Helen's life, including Witchcraft by Marion Gibson, and a show on the BBC called The Last Witch Trial. I haven't seen any of them because they're not available in Australia, but if you would like to watch them, they may be worthwhile. But as usual, I'd love to know what you think. Do you think Nellie had special powers or not? And do you think she should have been convicted under a Witchcraft Act that really didn't apply to her circumstances? So I'd love to know what you think. That's it from me. Until next time, stay safe and happy colouring.